Hi, everyone. Welcome today to our new episode. Today we have with us Professor Trumpener. She's Emily Sanford Professor of Comparative Literature and Professor of English at Yale University. And her research ranges across the late 18th century to the present day, focusing especially on British and European literature and culture, including film history, social history, visual culture, music, picture books, child readers, among many other topics. So, thank you so much for joining me today. And from what I can tell from your research, you're interested in kind of a range of topics across the last 2 to 3 centuries, especially in British and European literature and socio-political cultural history. So I know a lot of graduate students find it really difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing who or what to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you? And what led you to your own research?
Well, I'm usually working on about 3 or 4 or 5 topics at once. So I'm a kind of a short attention span person. And for many, many years, what I've done is I'll be working officially on one topic, and then I'll be doing a lot of free reading in another topic. And often that will crystallize in retrospect into another research project. So I wouldn't say that I decide decisively so much as I just accumulate stuff until there's some tipping point, and then I think, actually, I've got a real argument here, if that makes sense.
Amazing. Yeah, so it kind of feeds off each other almost.
Yes, yes. Or sometimes they're very contrasting. Like I've been working at the moment trying to finish a very long-standing project on, it started off being about Cold War film culture in the divided Germany, but now I'm writing first, before I finish that, I've started writing the prequel, which is about Nazi Germany and the Nazi occupation of Europe. And it's really good occasionally to just stop and write an essay about the picture book, which kind of, because it's such heavy material that I'm working with all the time. And okay, that's right. I can work on things that are lighter, that are more fun, that are more uplifting. Anyway, so balance there
Definitely.
too is a good thing, I think.
Definitely. Balance. Yeah, for sure. So, speaking of one of your current research projects, can you set the stage for us, so to speak, and tell us a few of the key themes at play in the time period we're going to look at today, which is the late 19th to the mid 20th century, what some might call European modernism? So, what do we need to know about what was happening at this time to aptly understand the rise of European modernism? And also, how can we understand the major characteristics of the fine art, literature, and drama kind of coming out of this period?
Well, actually, let me just take a step back, if that's okay, and frame it a slightly different way, but we'll get
Yeah.
there. So my first book was about the Romantic period in Britain and the Anglophone world, and I have a chapter in there about um, romantic obsessions with the nurse as a figure of oral culture. And while I was doing the research and writing of that book, I was reading the Virago Modern Classics, which was a reprint series, a feminist reprint series interested in like what was broad female modernism. And I kept finding things that actually seemed like extensions of the things I was finding in the Romantic period. So I thought this is really odd. This is so the nurse in the Romantic period is a kind of backward looking figure. She's the figure of tradition. What is she doing in these modernist works? So that was how the book project, the second book, it was a kind of offshoot. And my chapter in the book has a lot of footnotes about Freud and about modernist things, and you see this pattern is still there. But then I kind of got interested in its own right. So, having said that, I guess I have an ongoing interest in um, social history. So, uh, what was the role of servants? Who raised children and how? And it turns out to be very different across Europe. Sorry, I'm going right to the nurses, and I'll get back to modernism in a moment.
Definitely.
So it turns out that in Britain, there stopped being wet nursing around 1800 because of the influence of Rousseau. Rousseau was very against, um, he has a fascinating kind of mini treatise on this where he says, basically it's breaking the maternal bond between mother and child to put a child out to nurse the way it was very common in French-speaking Europe. Um, and then eventually the nurse is going to be sent away from the family, and the child will never get over that betrayal because they will be attached to the figure, and it's like the original sin. It's like Eve eating the apple. That's how bad it is when the nurse is sent away. And that stuck. And so in Britain, people stopped wet nursing and they started nursing their own children. And that's why in the Jane Austen adaptations, they're all wearing these Regency dresses that are foregrounding the breasts, and they have kind of a low neck so you can kind of see the breasts. Well, those are the maternal breasts that are newly a kind of object of fashion fixation because there's newly going to be maternal breastfeeding. In France, they keep having wet nursing all through the 19th century. In Spain, they still had wet nursing in the 1960s. So it really varies very widely across Europe how people are exactly handling this kind of micro level of who's doing what service for children and what's the division of labor around children. And I have a long interest in the history of childhood, so of course, I was very interested to read a bunch of things about this. And then you asked this is a much more general question, where does modernism come from? That's a very good
Mm.
question. I mean, there are a number of answers. There used to be the answer, it came out of World War One. That's not really very satisfying because World War One was just this big caesura. Actually, there's a lot of modernism before World War One. It depends on where you are in Europe, but um, it's definitely a kind of reaction to industrialization and various kinds of, the modernization process, which is happening starting in the late 18th century, and the emergence of the new nation state. And there's a lot of things, there's a lot of fundamental ways that society and the economy are being organized that really shift. And modernism is partly a euphoric reaction to this and partly a kind of dystopian read on what that's doing to us collectively. So it takes a bunch of different forms. And of course, one of the things that academics and curators and so on are particularly interested in is sort of more avant-garde modernism, where you take the form of the 19th century novel and you introduce in the late 19th century, you introduce stream of consciousness. And so you have new narrative perspectives and you're trying to recreate. And this is in tandem with things like experimental psychology, which is emerging as a discipline. So Gertrude Stein, for instance, a stalwart avant-gardist, worked with William James and also worked with other people in like the experimental psychological lab. So she was seeing how do people process dissociated sounds, what happens when can people process nonsense the way they can process full words. Anyway, and that obviously had a pretty profound impact on the way she was working. So part of what's happening in modernism are people are picking up things that are in the air. I was one of my graduate students has been one of our graduate students has been working towards a project about the 19th century where she's really interested in the blue books, which were these government reports, how both the British novel, the British kind of state of England novel, and then the early novel in India are working off these official reports as a form. So they're incorporating it. They're kind of docudramas in a certain way. They're trying to illustrate things the way these factual, somewhat statistically oriented reports are. So they're kind of both offsetting it and learning things from it. And maybe you could say that the modernist novel does the same thing with other kinds of discourse that's there, bureaucratic discourse, army discourse. Even if you look at people who are kind of soft modernists, like the World War One poets, my undergraduate thesis was about them, so I thought a lot about this back then. So um, they will replicate bits and pieces of World War One bureaucratic army jargon and then they will have some devastating line, and he did for us all with his plan of attack. So, in other words, this is the bureaucratic way of ordering people to their deaths and marching them around, and then this is the impact of it. So, part of modernism is a kind of breaking up and interrupting and questioning those official modes of discourse that are around. That's happening in the novel, and of course, visually, one of the first moves of 20th century modernism is cubism. And of course, it literally shatters the surface of perception. You have bits and pieces, and you have realia, you have the newspaper. So, in a way, you're having bits and pieces of discourse kind of woven into a new, richer visual fabric that's trying to reflect how people's perceptual apparatuses actually work. So, anyway, that's a very rough definition, and it doesn't hold for everything that the big umbrella of modernism has under it, but maybe it goes a little ways towards explaining.
No, definitely. Thank you so much for that. Definitely. And it's super interesting how it kind of flips across different disciplines. It touches art, film, literature, like everything you're saying.
Yes.
Which actually leads me into the project you're currently working on, which is a brilliant project about European modernists in various disciplines, actually, art, literature, film, more, and how they interact with the idea of nannies and nursemaids and their relationships with them. So these are those people who took care of them, right? Like the idea of a babysitter or a nanny today. This is their governess in effect. So you've written a fantastic talk on this entitled Modernism in the Nursery, Modernism in the Park, picturing early childhood in London and Paris. So, can you tell us firstly a little bit about maybe the inspiration for this project? How did you arrive at this idea, and what awakened you to its importance?
Yeah, well, I guess one thing to say is when I was working on this, when I first started working on this, I started reading children's literature again and starting to teach children's literature. And I think in retrospect, that was a part of a way to get ready to have my own child. I waited until I had tenure until I had a child, but I was a stepmother in throughout my 30s, and I had my child at the end of my 30s. And I was just trying to figure out, do I want now I'm successfully partnered with this wonderful person at last. And what do I want? Am I okay as a stepmother? Do I want my own child? What do I want? So it was part of a kind of life decision making, I think. So I was haunting the children's library again. I had been an avid reader of children's literature as a child with very vivid memories, even, the way the book looks. If I find at the old edition, the way it looks on the page will just release these deep depths of memory and feeling. So I have a pretty live emotional connection to that part of my own life. And I think also I was kind of stunned to realize that both of my parents, my father was an academic, but we grew up in an era where academics were badly paid. And so my mother was constantly, what could I can feed all five of us on 50 cents for lunch and $2 for dinner. So there was always this kind of penny pinching, and I realized that my parents had grown up under slightly different circumstances. My parents were both born in the early 30s, and my mother had grown up on a farm where there was the hired girl. It was during the Depression. My grandfather in Oregon grew filbert nuts, which boomed during the Depression. So the candy manufacturer, everybody wanted some kind of cheap sense of happiness. So he did fine. And so there was a hired girl, and the hired girl taught my mother to cut with her left hand. And so my mother, there was a servant in her life. And my father was in Berlin, grew up in Berlin, born in the Weimar period, and then grew up in Nazi Germany. And they also had a servant, and he was much fonder of the servant than he was of his mother. And I was in a kind of claustrophobic nuclear family, but to imagine that my parents had both had this experience of kind of other people in the household. And I think in the long run, for me, psychically, maybe this is not what you want to hear about, but maybe it's interesting. Um, it was a fantasy, like, could one have had a second mother who did the things that the first mother didn't do? That the mad housewife, that the person who was self-abnegating and said, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I just wanted to have children. But then it was guilt-inducing that she did everything for us. What if it had been a different kind of figure caring for us? Would that have made a difference? And of course, most of the modernists in Europe grew up under, middle or upper class circumstances, and they did have this. And the most avid strain of people are people who grew up in Russia because there was serfdom. And then even after serfdom was abolished, there were the memories of serfdom. So these were people who really belonged to the family in a literal sense. And one of the things that I found especially interesting once I started reading, there's like nursemaids everywhere. The Russian anarchists prided themselves, many of them grew up in military households or aristocratic households, which they found very emotionally cold. And their nurses were the spot of bright light and affection in their lives. And they couldn't believe that the nurses were politically subordinated to their parents' class, and they rebelled against this. And in a way, their subsequent fighting, they tried to assassinate the Tsar, and some of them became doctors and went to work among the poor. This was all an attempt to pay back, to the people of the nurse. So there was a kind of class politics. And I realized that in early modernism, Ibsen, Pirandello, Chekhov, the question of how the nurse is being treated often becomes a kind of moral barometer for what's wrong with society, how society should act. So I think it's either in the Three Sisters or the Cherry Orchard. I think it's the Cherry Orchard. The nurse gets sent away, and that's unbearable as a kind of moral wrong. Pirandello has a story, The Wet Nurse, about the wet nurse who has left her child to come work for the bourgeois family. I think the child dies, her own child dies, and what is morally owed to this figure? So it's there as a kind of point of moral concern before the turn of the century, and after the turn of the century, um, the nurse becomes a kind of muse figure often, and or as you could see from what I wrote, I was living in Chicago. I was teaching at University of Chicago and living in Chicago during the early years of this project. And I was near the Art Institute of Chicago, which has a very famous Impressionist collection. And because it has this famous collection, they had a million traveling shows of various the newly discovered Caillebotte and this person and that, Mary Cassatt. And
Mm.
virtually every show would have nurses in it. And so I would just think, oh, there's another one. I can't believe it. There's another modernist painter painting a nurse. So I started thinking about how ubiquitous this figure was. And in the essay, I argue that for the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists in Paris, but also foreign painters in Paris, people who worked in other places like London, um, the nursemaids are kind of part of the fabric of the city. And you often find this in urban literature as well. I mean, most famously, for instance, in Mary Poppins, where there's a real focus on the nurses taking the children here, the nurses taking the children there. But in Paris, for instance, they there was wet nursing all through the 19th century, and they would bring wet nurses from all over the country, usually from impoverished parts of the country. They had a federal bureaucracy which helped to place them and kind of manage their travel, and if their milk dried up, to try to stop them from falling into prostitution. So this was just a very complicated thing that they managed. And some children went out to remote villages to be nursed, but the infant mortality rate was higher there. So it was better if they came to Paris. So they wore folk costumes from all over France. And so for the Impressionists, on the one hand, this was a fascinating visual spectacle. And 19th century authors like Alphonse Daudet also wrote about this. There's this parade of the nurses. It's like a parade of all the different regions of France, like a pageant. And there they are, all And then for other impressionists, the fact that they were doing all of this childcare in public, because they would take the child to the park, they would reprimand the child, they would feed the child, it was all there for everybody to see. So it's as if you could peer into the dollhouse and see what was going on inside the bourgeois family, but it was out there in the park. And there were some of the parks of Paris became special haunts for nurses and children. They were kind of famous for that. Um, anyway, so it's like a whole thing. And it became a subject of genre painting. So there's tons and tons of genre painting. But some of it is also very detailed, and it's really about the individual nurse and the individual child, and often these very tender and lyrical portraits of what it's like when the nurse is carrying the child on its back, nursing the child, like breastfeeding the child. And these are very moving, I think. Um,
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. No, that's extremely interesting. And those themes of kind of a second mother, I think, are fascinating because it's not something we often think about how a nurse or a nanny or babysitter, often to the child, it is the primary caretaker. In a way, it is a kind of second mother, you know? And so
it is.
that's really,
It
really
is.
fascinating.
Well,
Definitely.
one of my first inklings about this actually came in graduate school where I was reading Freud's interpretation of dreams, and I was rereading
Classic.
it for a class on Freud. And there is this telling moment in it where, first of all, it turns out that he actually knows Czech because his nurse, he grew up in Vienna, but his nurse was Czech and, center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, of course, she talked Czech to him. So he has a kind of buried memory of it, and he can sing some songs in Czech. And I just thought this is fascinating. So the whole unconscious of Austro-Hungary, there's this hierarchy of languages and classes, and the unconscious is in a non-German language. Aha, that's fascinating. And then he has a dream he keeps dreaming about his nurse, and it's a prohibited dream because the nurse was sent away for stealing. And so she's a forbidden figure, but she's also a figure of loss. And of course, she recurs. And he is not interested in the nursemaid. He is interested in all of his theories about the biological parent and the Oedipal complex. But there is material to hand in a lot of his case studies to think about the nurse as an alternative to the parents. So that's another thing that I try to think about in this project on and off is, what if the nuclear family, which looks there's more of a nuclear family than there was 3 or 4 centuries before. So that's emerging as a new thing. And there's new theories about the family. But there's still all these other people involved. And what about them? And what kind of and I guess one thing that's really interesting to me politically, and if you think about different parts of the world or different situations, it gets more complex yet. What happens when somebody is raised by servants? Like basically all of the hands-on stuff is that for the first few years. And part of this is high infant mortality rates. The parents don't really invest much in the children until they're diapered, until they can already speak um, and they've survived. And then they become very interested in their education, but their primary education, how to talk, how to walk, how to defecate properly, etc., how to sleep on a normal schedule, that's all handled by a different group of people who are then just supposed to fade away. But basically, it means that people are implicitly bilingual, bicultural. And one of the recurring questions, for instance, in the American South, the white upper classes were raised by slave nannies or former slaves or the descendants of former slaves. And how then did they grow up to be racist since these were the first people they loved in a lot of cases? And as you can imagine, there's many fascinating, tormented, modernist, turn of the century, Charles Chestnut, who's a black writer of the turn of the century, writes really interesting about this. And is the mammy figure a conservative figure who can only identify with the master and isn't self-protecting? And then already in my book about Romanticism, I found there's a very interesting pattern. There's a lot of interest in Romanticism because the British Empire is expanding. What about the native nurse? If you hire native servants and they take care of your children, And then what if there's a native uprising? Which side is the nurse going to be on? Well, this
Mm.
problem doesn't go away. I mean, where is the nurse going to identify? And what kind of double consciousness does the child end up with? That's, to me, the really interesting thing. But, there are also, I have a chapter that's just about aesthetics because it turns out that for a lot of, especially like the composers, a lot of them will write like a nurse's song suite or something. And they're really trying to get at the origin of song and the origin of language and, that very first childhood consciousness awakening to sound and meaning and form and anyway, and then you have these visual artists, like for instance, some of the Russian constructivists had these I'm not thinking of the name right now, but anyway, there's a Jewish family of constructivists who are very important. And the nurse was Christian and kept this icon with a candle burning on it in the corner of their rooms. And one of the brothers has an incredible kind of his first experience of art was looking at that icon with the light on it. So, and that's a kind of biculturalism too, because he wasn't being raised Christian, but she was Christian, and so he was pulled into that world. And so, in a way, the nurse becomes potentially the nurse or anybody who's raising the child becomes a kind of portal for the child's first and most and deepest experiences. So that's very interesting, and that's why in a lot of cases the nurse gets that these modernists come back to the nurse as a kind of muse figure, often very positively, sometimes very negatively or pejoratively. Um, Marinetti grew up in Africa and had an African nurse, and he has racist, nasty things to say about her. But for the most part, it's rather different. There's a kind of glow of nostalgic memory around the nurse, around the nurse's care, and so on. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's a
No,
huge
definitely.
topic, unfortunately, so I'm still grappling with it. I have many filing cabinets full of material. Also, when I started the project, I didn't realize that because it took me many, many, many years to that I've been working and finding stuff. Well, I have other stuff on the front burner. In the meantime, it became normal again to have a nurse because of the dot-com fortunes, and there was suddenly a class of people who employed nurses again. So far from being this retro topic with no relevance, there was constantly new information. There was the nanny trial, the nanny who killed the child, the nanny who neglected the child. What about immigrant nurses and leaving their children behind? There's a huge literature now. So I've been collecting all of that too and reading it, but I'm really more interested in the more historical stuff, but it's not irrelevant. And I guess one thing that's very interesting is, one worries, oh my God, if my child were raised by a servant, they would turn out wrong. Well, actually, the historical record doesn't really agree with that. I have to say, people have asked me, of course you had a nanny. No, of course I never had a nanny. Whoever takes care of the child is the primary figure. I wanted to be the primary figure myself. But it turns out that having these other figures in the child's life is not necessarily bad or damaging at all. So I think that is interesting for present day anxieties about this topic.
Definitely. It seems actually it has historical groundings, but is still extremely relevant today. No,
Yes.
definitely. And I wanted to also ask you, so as part of this research, you engage with a kind of range of works across disciplines, across art and literature, in particular. And so I wanted to ask you what it was like when you were bridging these two worlds, these two disciplines, noticing how they interact with the same themes of nurses and wet nurses and nursemaids, but in different mediums. So, did you notice any patterns of how writers and visual artists maybe interact with the themes of childhood, nannies, and nursemaids differently? Or maybe it was actually quite uniform, but I don't know. I just find this kind of interesting narrative.
It's thematically pretty unified, but I really like a project that forces me to stretch beyond my formal education and try to grapple with something new. So I'm always pushing myself, which is, not so easy, but it keeps me feeling alert and like something the neurons are firing actively. And Just now, and here's a small example, which doesn't really answer your question, but it's still a very vivid memory. So my child is now grown up, but when I started this project, he was not yet conceived, and then he was an infant, and so on. And a few weeks after he was born, there was a big exhibit of Mary Cassatt, which was an hour away at the Art Institute. And I said, we just have to go because I really have always liked her, and this is my chance. And so we brought the baby with us to the exhibit. And the funny thing was, I had this conviction that because I had already spent so many hours trying to figure out what does this child want? What does the expression on his face mean? I had this illusion, at least in my sleep-deprived way, that I could understand the expression on the mothers and children's faces because she has a lot of mother and child pictures. She didn't have children herself, but she's very interested in this subject, and nurses and children. And so it made me feel, oh, I'm learning something new. It's not just that I'm brain dead at the moment. I am learning new interpretive skills, which are going to be of use and relevance to my research because I will understand. It's like learning to understand the language of the animals or something. I'm attuned to a different pitch than I was even a few weeks ago. That was a really good feeling. I know that doesn't answer the question about what it's like to try to
No,
tackle
it's very,
physical stuff um, but it was
no,
great
it's
to just, become an amateur art historian. And I then went on, I ended up editing a book with an art historian about the panorama in the 19th and 20th century, the panorama, the visual panorama, the 19th century big painting in the round, and its afterlife in photography, film, and performance art. So anyway, I became more of an art historian than I was when I first started thinking about these things. But it's exciting. I mean, I think one really good thing about graduate school is you learn to read your way into anywhere you want to go. And you aren't really limited by the formal training you've had. You know how to give yourself a semi-formal training at just about anything. And if you just spend enough time on it, you can work your way into adjacent things. It's not impossible. Because you've really, graduate school teaches you how to read carefully. It teaches you how to read and synthesize information. It teaches you to be disciplined in the ways you go about learning things. So you don't have to stop just because you get a job in a certain field or you stay in academia or you leave academia. You can keep using those skills. So I've tried to do that as a way of kind of keeping alive mentally, if that makes
no,
sense.
definitely. Yeah. I think it's really interesting that you were saying you kind of had an insight into something that you didn't have before through your own personal experience. You're
Yes.
interacting with art differently and you're interacting with kind of objects that exist outside of yourself. Like the external world
Yes.
has
Yeah.
changed for you in a way. You have a new insight based on kind of your newfound relationship with your child. I think that's extraordinary, actually.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you feel like you've got a sixth sense or something. And
Yeah.
maybe that's illusory, but maybe it isn't. Because certainly, when you biologically reproduce, and it's probably true if you adopt as well, I mean, you have new feelings that you haven't had before about you feel like a biological being in a different way. You feel you're linked to natural processes. I mean, it's very transformative. And instead of us always thinking, "Oh my God, why doesn't that woman get back from her maternity leave? I'm really sick of having to carry her burden for her." If we didn't think in such a managerial way about everybody's lives, but we thought certain experiences are hard and complicated, but they're transformative. Anyway, I so I guess this project is also a way of expressing that the lives of girls and women are not trivial. The history of female labor is not trivial. It's actually foundational. And to find all of these artists and musicians and poets for whom this was an absolutely transformative figure who they thought they got their ideas from art from is really, really interesting. Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, the Spanish poet and playwright, has this incredible essay on lullabies. And he's a folklore collector. He's from southern Spain, but they had nurses he's from a upper class family. They had nurses from the poorest parts of Spain. And so he talks about the lullaby as with her milk, my nurse imparted this bile to me, and the bitterness of the nurse's life experience that is, at this moment coursing through my veins. And the implication is I make my poetry partly out of my anger and her suffering. And so, you could argue that's a kind of quasi-Christological, Jesus' suffering transforms itself into our vision of the universe. But I still find that very striking. And so it's to him, it's like a poetic principle. And it's not only sweetness and love, but it's also pain. Um,
Definitely. Yeah. And this actually kind of leads perfectly into my next question for you, which is about the painting Gabrielle et Jean,
oh yeah.
which you write on in your amazing project. And so this is an 1895 painting, which I think sets up the themes of your project beautifully. This painting is of the French film director and screenwriter Jean Renoir when he was a child, and he's being held by his nursemaid, Gabrielle. She shows him how to play with a small toy cow, while he appears to also play with a piece of clay in his hand himself. And so you have some brilliant quotes I'm just going to read out for everyone. So you write, quote, steeped in Gabrielle's stories of her native village in Burgundy, taken by Gabrielle to his first puppet theater, his first movies, Jean Renoir would grow up to be an important filmmaker. His lifelong attachment to the cinema as the most modern art form of his time, mediated by his lifelong attachment to his nurse and to the connection she represents to the oldest, most elemental forms of art. So, ingrained in this picture is what you call a child's version of creation, which I think is a beautiful phrase. And you also write, framed by the nurse, the little boy experiments with the making of the world and of art, with materiality and object relations. So it seems that through Gabrielle, through his nursemaid, she not only rears him into the adult world, but into the artistic world, like the world of art, the world of culture and literature, the world of creative expression. So, can you tell us a little bit more about this kind of phenomenon, if you will, and about how nursemaids and nannies can inspire not only the learning of social manners and social customs, how to act, but also the awakening of a child's own inner artistic drive?
Yeah, I would say inner artistic drive and also sense of humanness. That's part of it as well. Because I guess, as you can tell, the genesis of this project is all linked to me personally and biographically becoming a mother. So, what does it mean to be a lap? Is a lap just, um, I spent my whole day being a lap. What was I doing? I didn't get any of my stuff done. I was just a kind of surround for this other person. But actually, that's very crucial. And it makes you realize why human life is infinitely precious because of the amount of human care that goes into every life. So I think there's that as well. But yeah, I think, often, as I've mentioned, a bunch of the composers are really, and the poets are really interested in the nurse sang or the nurse didn't sing because she was too sad to sing or the nurse spoke. There's this wonderful poem. I don't think it's in what I sent you, but it's Hadosovich, who's a famous Russian Silver Age poet. He has this incredible poem for his nurse, and he's himself, I think, Lithuanian, and he's also Jewish, I think, and the nurse is Christian and Russian. Why does he write in Russian? Because he learned Russian from the nurse. It's the nurse's language. And therefore, because of what the nurse has gone through, the nurse's own child died while she was nursing him. And she brought him, Hadosovich, as an infant, was about to die. And she was brought in and she saved him, but at the expense of her own child. And so out of her suffering, out of her sacrifice, is born his right to be a Russian poet alongside any other Russian speaker. So he sees a kind of moral right and he sees a kind of aesthetic grounding in the language and the suffering that the language represents. So that's powerful stuff, I think. And in
Definitely.
other cases, it's less heavy than that and less political. And it's more just about the nurse taught me what it was to sing. The nurse taught me music. The nurse taught me poetry. The nurse told me and sang traditional things. And that got everything started.
Definitely. How would you say the child's own inner identity then is affected almost if their nurse is of a different background, different language, different culture? It does feel quite like you were talking about Freud earlier. It does feel quite Freudian because Freud links the child's kind of social symbolic capital S subjecthood to the parents and object relations and
Right.
everything they learn biologically. So if that identity is fractured in a way, what does that mean for their future? I don't know.
I mean, in a way, of course, you could say a lot of modernism is either a form of protest or it expresses a kind of inorganic, fractured sense of the world. And maybe this first fracturing is important because the world is split between the mother and the nurse, or the mother and the father and the nurse. Um,
Mm,
Certainly, I mean, maybe we shouldn't get into this because this is a whole topic in and of itself, but there's also the question of sexuality in relationship to the nurse because I went to at one point, I was living in Chicago and in Indiana. So I went to the Kinsey Institute, which is at Bloomington, and I said, do you have nurse pornography? Oh, no, we have lactation pornography. We don't, but but on the other hand, have you read Wilhelm Reich's autobiography? No, I haven't. Oh, well, he was seduced by his nursemaid or seduced by his governess or whatever. So for some children, they have early sexual experience in and around the servants. A bunch of Freud's patients, actually, this was the story for them. So, that's perhaps could be seen as the shadow side of some of these relationships, or it could just be seen as part of social formation. You're coming of age with the sexual mores of a different class of people who may have different ideas about sex or different practices around sex. Anyway,
mm,
it just makes me think. Freud. I mean, I love Freud. Freud is an incredibly powerful and often very profound writer. I was able as a student to read Freud in German, which is a great pleasure. He's a wonderful writer in German. But he has blinders in certain ways, and this is where one of the blinders are. He really everybody who's not the biological family is really has secondary importance in his model. And I guess one thing that I got really interested in is it seems like there is a popular psychology that doesn't believe that. So there's all these kind of middlebrow modernist novels from the 20s and 30s in which in the middle of the proposal scene, somebody will evoke old nurse. Or you have the Stream of Consciousness novel by Mason Clare, in which the child is fixated on the nurse, and then he falls in love inappropriately enough with a lower class woman who's worked as a hospital nurse. So there's some kind of carryover of transferential relationship that's structuring his sexual desires, is this nurse stuff. Um,
mm.
anyway, but just the ubiquity of the proposal, as Nanny used to say, why are you bringing up Nanny? We're in the midst of the proposal scene. This is the last page of the book. What is Nanny doing here? Well, she's a important psychic figure somehow. Uh,
That's so interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
So they're kind of they're,
Robert Louis Stevenson dedicated The Child's Garden of Verses to his nurse Cummie, Alison Cummingham, who he
wow,
called in the dedicatory poem, "My second mother, my first wife," which I find
wow.
really striking. Yes, yes, yes. So,
Really infiltrating the child's psyche in every kind of
yeah.
way.
And just saying a love object is a love object, and it's significant to that extent.
Mm. This okay,
It's always
yeah,
assuming the nurse
very
is
true.
loving
And
the child and not taking revenge on the child. And of course, there's a minority of accounts that recount that scenario, which is ugly and terrifying. But the majority of accounts
definitely,
suggests it is not in the nurse's self-interest to give her all to the child, but many of them clearly did. So,
as you were saying, also her own child died while she gave
right,
herself to the
right,
child.
right.
Right. Definitely. There also seems to be kind of two realms in juxtaposition in this relationship between the nurse and the child. So, kind of like what you're getting at. On the one hand, it's the nurse's job to integrate the child into social symbolic society and the symbolic order, to create a symbolic subject out of them with a personality and language that complies to our order of logic in our
Like
world.
toilet trained,
Um,
keep food down, all those basics, right? Bodily control.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you write, quote, the child begins to know the world because the nurse is there to point, to show, to assign names to things seen. So this is the nurse's job to integrate the child into the symbolic order of sense. But on the other hand, a lot of the themes that we're currently touching on, the introduction of the child to art and the maternal relationship between the two, and also, as you're saying, this very kind of strange psychosexual relation, this kind of awakening, this kind of strange realm, this inner hidden world as well. All of these things are also all being evoked between the relation in the relationship between the two, the child and the nurse. And this really reminds me of Kristeva's conception of the social semiotic, not the symbolic, the realm of chaos, art, poetry. So would you say that the relationship between the 19th century child and the nursemaid is kind of dual in this way? Is it a product of both the semiotic and the symbolic, or how do you
Well,
see it?
that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess I wouldn't have used those terms, but that seems
Yeah.
pretty appropriate, actually. Yes. And, on the one hand, I guess I'm just always interested. I work on the history of the novel also, and I love the 18th century novel because it's really chaotic and experimental. And the 19th century novel is this heavy, solid edifice. And then in the 20th century, everything kind of breaks up again. And so I'm always a bit distrustful of how solid everything seems in the 19th century. The household seems so solid. Bourgeois complacency is what it is, but people have psychic lives and they're really complicated. And this is a setup, as you're pointing out, which is designed to evoke rivenness and, a kind of a double consciousness, to quote Du Bois, or, you know, uh, a differentiated way of seeing things, or, how are you going to get your emotions about this marginalized figure, how are you going to stuff them back in to where they are supposed to belong when that's not really what you feel about her? You actually feel more strongly about her than you do about the mother. I was going to say, I think it's so interesting that the two cultures which are most nurse obsessed, in my view, just in terms of numbers of works, depth of obsession, it's Britain and Russia. And in Russia, it's partly because of serfdom and what that was and what that meant. And in Britain, it's partly because upper class children are often sent away to boarding school at a very young age. So they leave the realm of the nurse and they're sent to a kind of barrack situation where they're being trained and drilled and, have their peers around them. So the parental input is minimal pretty continuously. And the feeling is they're pushed out of the nurse's realm into this very cold world that they don't really know how to survive psychically. So then there's the cult of the nurse and in Brideshead Revisited, oh, let's go to the nurse's room. The nurse is living on as a dependent. Yes, well, that's where we can really be ourselves. That's what the Russian anarchists also said. The nurse's room is where we can be our true selves, is where we can be children. Nowhere else are we allowed to be children. We have to be disciplined, but in the nurse's room, we can be our full selves. And that's what we're looking for in a social revolution, that our full selves can live on. So it's just interesting that it also fuels these utopian social movements. I do find that
Yes,
powerful and not accidental.
definitely. And that kind of makes me think of when the child grows up, as you're saying, they leave the
Yes.
nurse. What often happens to the relationship between the child and nurse after the child grows up?
Well, sometimes, of course, they have no idea where the nurse is. The nurse goes on to the next job, and they're with one family a few years. Those children are grown up. They go on to another job and another job and another job. We've got some interesting counterexamples. I don't know if people in Britain will know about Harriet the Spy, a truly wonderful children's book from the 60s set in New York. And the framework is her nanny is going to go away to be married. And Harriet the Spy basically has a kind of nervous breakdown. And Luckily, her nurse is very wise and she quotes Dostoevsky at her and she helps her to see, okay, you're a weird little girl, but you're going to become a writer. It's going to be okay. You can channel your weirdness and your standoffishness towards ordinary society into these productive channels. And okay, everything. So it's about the transition from life with a nurse to life after the nurse. And as I
Mm.
said, you also have all of these instances where, well, it's so funny. Uh, what is her name? Vita Sackville-West's cousin, Edward Sackville-West, wrote two novels about nurses and nurslings. One of them is the autobiography of a nurse, which is actually quite a recurrent mode from the 19th century onward. How does the nurse feel about having had this life of service? So that's book one, which is Modernist and Stream of Consciousness. Book two is set during the rise of fascism in Europe, and her nurslings are scatter across Europe and end up becoming anti-fascist fighters, kind of in the nurse's name. So that's what happens to them. They spend a lifetime fighting injustice on behalf of the
Mm.
nurse as a kind of crusade. Anyway, I just find this is interesting. Um,
Definitely. Yeah, it seems that there's almost it's kind of a breadth of options. It can either really
yes,
impact the child's life and it can really like feature in their everyday life, day to day, and continue that closeness can continue, or it can kind of in a way evaporate into thin air,
right, right.
and I think that that mediation is potentially it's very similar to the idea of leaving childhood behind, and you can leave
Yes,
childhood behind in
yes,
this way, or you can kind of take it with you and make it influence every day as an adult as well. It's kind of that
right.
idea of
And on the one
happening.
hand, you have the Mason Clare example where he glommed onto the nurse as an infant, and then he had to marry the lower class woman because only then would he feel he was back with the nurse. Okay, and that's
Mhm.
depicted as kind of neurotic, actually, and understandable, but neurotic. But then you could also become a crusader for justice throughout the world. So you could turn it outward and, fight for a more equitable society. That would be the less neurotic thing to do, I think, is the implication.
Definitely, definitely. Well, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I have learned so much about this, and I'm sure everyone listening to has as well. So thank you, first and foremost. Your project is absolutely fascinating, and I cannot wait for it to be published so everyone can see it.
All right.
But my final question for you is, do you have any advice for young scholars who are interested in studying European modernism and the role of the novel in British and European history and culture, or as we're talking about, the role of nurses, nursemaids, and nannies in 19th and 20th century Europe? So, do you have any advice for anyone
Well, I
interested
guess
in?
I would say don't be afraid to work on things that other people will criticize as trivial. I mean, every time I teach children's literature, I feel like some of my colleagues are kind of, oh no, she's doing that. Then why is she doing that? It's so banal. It isn't banal. It's the start of everything for everybody. It's everybody was a child reader, etc. I mean, I could grandstand about this for a long time, but I don't think it's trivial. The students don't think it's trivial. It's actually fascinating and important. So I think you've got to go with who you really are, you have to it's really important to pick topics that you care deeply about and that you have some kind of personal stake. This is partly why I'm detailing, I thought I might want to have children, so I started working on childhood and childcare. Well, that makes sense. That's actually a pretty common
Mm,
lots of women academics and some men too start teaching children's literature after they have children. They read a lot of things aloud. They realize, oh, this is really interesting. They discover it that way. That's an embarrassing thing about them, but it's not that embarrassing. It's a good thing, right? It's a reordering of priorities. It's a better sense of where one's priorities are and what's important and what is less important. So, um, anyway, I like it about this project that it involves high modernists, I mean, canonical figures to a person almost, and this trivial topic of the household, trivial in quotes, that's good, I think. Let's mix it up.
definitely. So it's almost like follow your passions. kind of.
Oh, it's absolutely follow your passions, right? Because that's what you're going to be most obsessed with. You need a lot of tenacity to get through a long dissertation, for instance. And if you deeply care or working on it solves some kind of set of psychic issues for you or gives you sort of psychic relief, that's a big motivator to keep working. So I believe that really strongly.
I love that, the solving of psychic issues. I love that phrasing. I think that's very true. Definitely. Well, thank you so much again.
Sure, you're very
Uh,
welcome. Take good care. Bye.